All right. Welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the very important question, what's the absolute best way to do things that we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I'm here with Shawn McCool. Shawn, do you want to say a quick hello?
Hello.
Um, Shawn is, I think, I don't know if, I think maybe I got a little bit into event sourcing before I came across your event sourcery course on YouTube. But I feel like your course on event sourcing introduced me relatively early on to a lot of the concepts around event sourcing, and so it was very instrumental in my early understanding of the concept. And I have gone on to uh, become pretty interested in the subject. And we've been using the Spotsy event sourcing package at Internachi for many years now, and Daniel and I co-authored Verbs and have been sort of advocating for slightly different approach to event sourcing for the last year or so. And then it seems like you've kind of, I don't know, maybe I just wasn't looking in the right places, but it seems like you've kind of come back into the conversation a little bit more recently. Is that does that feel true? Do you feel like you're starting to like want to have these conversations again, or were you just elsewhere and I wasn't looking in the right place?
Yeah, so I guess I worked really hard to make the event sourcery videos. It took me a long time because I had no idea what I was doing with content creation. And I'd make a video and I'd hate it and I'd start over again. And it's only like 3.5 hours or something like this. And it still took me like a year to produce. So that was
I can believe
a
it.
big endeavor. After that, I was working on Laracon EU, working on stuff like this. Uh, and I just kind of I was focusing on building my own tools and experimenting with my tools. And I wasn't doing a lot in public. But now I think I see a big resurgence in this topic. Like, so a lot of people are bringing it back up again. And it's interesting to me because this is one of the things I love the most, to be completely honest. I have been enamored with it for like 10 years now. And all of this developing and new ways of seeing how this stuff can come together. It's all very exciting to me. And so I'm here for it. I'm 100% here for this.
That's awesome. Well, you've been doing a series of YouTube, or not, I don't know if it's just YouTube broadcasts or Twitch broadcasts, but you've been doing a series of sort of live Q&A talking about event sourcing. How many of these have you done? Is it 2 or 3 now?
Yeah, it's three. It's really for me just an experiment. Like I want to see if there's room here for me to make content, if I can pace it well enough, if I can find a format that's a good fit, if it's fun enough to keep sustainable, if people care at all. I don't know anything about it, so I just started, and every week, I get better, or I try an experiment that doesn't work or whatever, and I guess we'll see where it goes from here.
I like the approach that you've taken of like trying to make it a more live experience. Um, that's something that I have, excuse me, that I've tried to do myself in various formats, but it's not easy because you really have to you have to get people to commit to show up at the time that you're doing it, which is a challenge, especially, I mean, in the world that we live in, where half my friends are in Australia or in Europe, or in absolutely different time zones from me. I mean, even us today, it's like I typically would record in the afternoon, but it's 9:30 here because it's already 3:30 in the afternoon for you. So um, that poses a bunch of new challenges. But I really love the premise of it, and it feels like it's been working pretty well. Like, you've had a couple of great guests, you've had a bunch of interesting sort of questions and conversations. Does it feel like the experiment is like going as well as you'd hoped?
Yeah, I would say like for me, there are high points and low points. I'm very picky about like pacing, like what I think is an okay pacing. So if things start to slow down too much, I get like a little bit antsy about that, and so I want to try something new to manage the pacing. There's a limited amount of preparation I can do. I can do some, but I can't like really script it and have it all
Right.
prepared, and if even if I did that, it wouldn't be sustainable for me to keep doing. But thank you for the kind words. I really want to have an opportunity to talk to like complete strangers, and I post on Twitter one day. I said, "Hey, just if you want to talk about event sourcing or something, if you're having trouble with it, or if you're having challenges at work, just talk to me. I'll block out a small period of time and we'll have a conversation because I want to get more experience with like a variety of people's circumstances, and I want to think about that, and I want to also just have these conversations." But then I was also thinking, what would be cool if this was in public, and because with a lot of this stuff, there's a lot of hand waving, like, oh, you just do this thing. And in reality, it's really hard to get into the topic with people, because if I were to tell you all of the detail that you need to know to talk about some topics, you'd get super bored because it's very specific to my work, and it's like it's too intricate. If I ramble on about work specific stuff for too long, nobody would be able to follow it, right? You have to be onboarded onto those ideas at work for like a year at a time, in order
Right.
to figure it out. But I think that there is a way to have a conversation about the parts of software engineering that we usually don't get to dig into in public in a way that I think is helpful for people.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I feel like there's a bit of a I don't know, there's a bit of a movement in that direction I see. I don't know if you're familiar with with Ben Holman, but he's been doing this pyramid scheme where he's just got a calendar. You can block a time to pair with him for an hour, and sometimes you work on something that you're interested in. Sometimes he will pair on something that he's interested in with you. Um, and that's been sort of like spreading because his kind of deal is, okay, if you pair with me, then your commitment is that you offer to pair with someone else afterwards.
Okay.
um and that's been very fun. um and just in general, yeah, I feel like maybe this is a little bit of the aftermath of everybody kind of surviving lockdown. Is We've looked for new ways to kind of connect with each other, and this is just another one of them. But I don't know, I love to see it. It's been really fun to watch and participate in some of these things. um and so, yeah, I guess, you know I hopped on your last stream for about 20-25 minutes, and we were talking a bit, and I'd love to get back to that conversation, or, sort of pick up from there for a while. But I also, before we get there, I feel like, um I I guess I kind of came into the Laravel community not late, but later than a lot of folks. I was kind of just like in uh, in in my own old school PHP code base, just kind of chugging along for a long time. And I came to Laravel in like the 5.6, 5.8 era, something like that. Which, obviously is a number of years ago now, but I feel like a lot of people who are sort of old school Laravel, that they talk about that as though that's like the modern era of Laravel. That's like there's like this sort of split point there. Um, and so for me, I guess I don't know if it's just like just circumstance or happenstance or whatever, but I was introduced to you really only as like this event sourcing guy um until we were on the PHP roundtable, when it turns out, oh no, you're like a old school long term Laravel community person as well, and I don't know how I didn't know that. So I'd love to just hear, like, I don't know, a little bit of uh yeah, your backstory, how you got into that space, and then like how you got to where you are now, which sounds like a very different kind of professional world to some degree.
Yeah, I would have to say I was doing a lot of PHP. I started with PHP in like 97 or something like this, and it was a very different beast. And I was doing a lot of PHP stuff. And at some point in time, actually, I was like let go from my business, from my job, because honestly, I don't think I was doing very good work. I was doing the best I possibly could, but the world had like progressed past mysql.php at the top
Mhm.
of the file, and then I started discovering like the world of frameworks like CodeIgniter, like what was there, and it's still like an early version. It had some time to mature, and I started discovering, hey, I could go to these meetups, or hey, I could meet people, and I started being exposed to so many new ideas that it like completely changed everything I was doing. I'm just like, I always wanted, like, programming to me is one of my primary interests. Like so I found it when I was 9, and it was magic to me, like literal sorcery. I had an idea and it manifested. It was like casting a
Yeah.
spell. And so I when I found CodeIgniter, when I found the communities, I could go to the conferences or the meetups or whatever. Everything changed for me like overnight. I started learning. I basically found a font of wisdom that I could just continue drinking from forever. And to this day, I find like things like meetups and conferences to be the most important things in my career, because you network and you meet people, you get exposed to ideas, and every once in a while you find something that you didn't realize you were missing, right? So
Yeah, for sure.
I was getting tired of CodeIgniter because it was not evolving anymore. And I was like, okay, well, I need this thing to be more like, quote, modern. I was looking around the world, seeing like the things that was happening in Ruby at the time and stuff like this with Rails. And I was like, I want more of this. And I basically switched my company. At this time, I had made a bunch of CodeIgniter tutorials, and people came up to me and said, hey, I tried to make a website for my business, but it's too complicated for me. But I like the way you talk about it. Will you do it? So I made a business just making people's stuff from those tutorials. And at some point in time, I went to CodeNetter Conf, and I was like, okay, why aren't you announcing anything new happening with the framework? Like, why aren't we modernizing? And they're like, it's fine. And so, okay, I'm like, this is not okay. So I wrote this article called CodeIgniter is Dead, or I can't remember what it was, but it was kind of a really controversial article at the time. I think you can still find like on the Wayback Machine, but you got it just, it kind of blew up. And at this time, I was like, okay, maybe just choose Laravel. And Laravel was, I don't know, Laravel 2, maybe at the time, maybe Laravel 3, I can't recall. And
Okay.
this guy Taylor, like there was a IRC channel of like 10 people on it. In this channel, Dale Reese, Taylor, maybe Ian Landsman, I don't remember, just a variety of people. And they were all super cool. And everybody was like really into like, let's have a PHP framework that's drawing from these other sources and it's more modern. And so that's kind of how I got into Laravel. And then I got super into Laravel because I was working for myself. We had this IRC channel, and I spent all of my time just talking to new joiners about how the framework worked, about how to do different things in the framework, about how to think about, developing this thing or that thing. And before I knew it, the IRC channel got up to like 450 members. And I was like, okay, it's time for the next generation. And like, I kind of just stepped back, and, like at my time in the community, I created a Laravel meetup in the Netherlands. Laracon EU founded that with a colleague of mine. Laravel.io, a colleague of mine, and I built the original version of that. We made the original Laravel podcast, a bunch of stuff. It was like basically like all I could think about all the time was like community projects having to do with Laravel. And it was really awesome. Still, so many of my friends, my closest friends, I met on that adventure. And yeah, so mostly I just these days, I'm doing a little bit different work. I'm working in Java, which I'm not super happy with, but the technical challenges are cool. And doing some other stuff, there's not really a space for that for me. And when I'm doing something on the side, I'm trying to figure out like, okay, how can I push some boundary or another? So I'm focused on like Erlang or Elixir, and like really digging into something different, because what I'm trying to do is break my mental models and reform them in a different way, right? So I'm just
Sure.
looking to break stuff. And that's kind of where I am now. I'm not really doing a lot of community effort, but I do miss the community, and my time with the Laravel community was some of my best time.
Yeah, I mean, the Laravel community is really it is special. I mean, I feel like that's a little bit of just a thing people say, but it really does feel true. I'm going to Laracons and meetups and just being connected to these people online, like it just feels like a real welcoming group of people who become friends. which hasn't been my experience in other programming communities. Not to say that there aren't other programming communities that are like that. Um, but yeah, it really is a lovely place to be, and I really appreciate it. And I mean, um, it's interesting because it feels like um there's a new round of community stuff happening right now. Again, I think kind of coming out of the pandemic, a lot of the events and meetups that existed either shut down entirely or paused for a long time. And I think that in the recent years, even when folks were starting to gather again, um, I think it just took people a long time to get used to being around groups again.
Yeah, for sure.
Um, but I know for me, starting to go, going to the first Laracon in Nashville after the pandemic, and then going to the one in Dallas, my experience very much was just like, I can't do this only once a year, you know? And all of our local meetups shut down. Even before the pandemic, there really was the PHP meetup had closed years before the pandemic, and a lot of the other groups that I was involved with all sort of just petered out a little while before then, or finally ended with lockdown. Um, and so yeah, I've been organizing a local Philly meetup, and I totally get it. It is just like just really fun. It's really fun to like connect with your local community, and I can really see why it could take over your life to some degree. It's like I love to like have these interactions and be around these people, and it's been really
Yeah, and
joy.
you can get a lot out of it. There's a lot of ways you can benefit from doing a thing. I think sometimes you get somebody who will organize and stay around for a really long time, and there's a lot they bring a lot of value because they know so much, they've made so many connections that they can make this happen. But I think it's also like really important to continue to give like the next generation. I don't mean generation like age wise, but like the next group who've come in who are like at this point in their career or in their adoption or in their entrance into the community where they're super motivated and really leverage that motivation, have them organize more things, have them participate in more things. And I
Yeah.
think this is one of the things Laravel has done really well over time is being like really welcoming such that new people come in, they're super pumped just to be there with one another, and they will take this labor that needs to be done happily, and they get a lot out of it as well. They get more connections, they get the all of their little endeavors get a little bit more boosting, and there's just a lot of value there. But I think that when I was trying different communities like the Scala community and stuff like this, I didn't get this vibe at all. It was like almost hostile.
Mhm.
It was not for me. But the I'm in the Elixir community now, and they're really cool. And I still, most of my friends that are in my programming Discord and stuff are very much in the Laravel community, and I don't think I'm going to lose those roots anytime soon.
Yeah. You said you're doing Java right now. Are you getting to use Kotlin at all, or is it like OG?
No, it's not as bad as it's not as bad as what I would call OG because Java also has changed a lot over time, like PHP
Okay.
has, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're coming at it with a very different culture, and there's something about the more what I consider like minimalistic, keep it naive until it needs to be more complex type of culture that I see in PHP that resonates more with me. When I'm dealing
Mhm.
with Java, everything's so much more complex, and I don't
Mhm.
think often for the betterment of the system, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the last time I wrote a line of Java code is probably 2003. So that's the style of Java that I'm thinking of. But I not maybe not recently now, but in the last couple of years, I started to learn a little bit of Kotlin because I wanted to write a PHP Storm plugin.
Yeah.
Um, and I actually find that language very, like, I don't know, inspiring. I totally agree with what you were saying earlier. I don't get the opportunity to do it as much as I'd like, but there's something really, really powerful about just like learning a new programming language or a new framework or a new, just a new way of thinking, down to just like syntax things and like and like sort of like what's the idiomatic way of approaching a problem in this like sort of ecosystem, even if it's not specific to the language. It's just like there are little things that you will do that everyone does in this language because that's just how it's done, um that like make a lot of sense, and I've found bleed can bleed into my sort of coding aesthetic in general, if it's not like a language feature. And then there are language features that you're just like, ah, man, I wish that PHP would would implement this, um so it is really fun.
Yeah, I think when I discovered event sourcing, like at first I had to discover domain events as a concept, and then I started leveraging those as everywhere I possibly could. Then when I started actually building event source systems, I was like, okay, and there's a switch flipped to my brain, and now all I wanted to do is find new ways to do the things I was already doing. Because
Mm,
if they could be this nice, right, then
right.
what else could I be replacing, right? So that's where like this focus on the actor model and other stuff that I'm focused on now is coming from. Like event sourcing taught me that something can be very similar to what I'm already doing, but radically different at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, that that's a really great takeaway. It's like, um it's easy to get stuck in certain ways of thinking, and a lot of times there's a good reason for that. It works, it's effective, you already know it, like that's fine. Um but sometimes that does mean that you're like missing out on a whole other sort of way of seeing things that might make your life a lot better, or might make, the applications that you write easier to understand, or, some all sorts of different benefits. Yeah. No, I definitely get that. Well, okay, so let's get back to event sourcing, because I do I did really look forward to talking about this with you. So, um, I think I think for me, like the biggest thing that I am focused on right now, and honestly, I mean, Daniel and I have talked a little bit about just dropping the term event sourcing from the Verbs docs, and sort of like from how we talk about verbs, because um I I think that like it can be easy to get caught up in like sort of the like technical, like what is event sourcing, what is the formal definition of event sourcing, which frankly I just don't really care. um but the thing that like was the big aha moment for me really came down to this idea that like it's the events that actually happen. And as programmers, we work so hard and we twist ourselves in all sorts of different ways to try to model this data that represents what is the outcome of these events, right? And we throw away so much real information, and we have to jump through all these weird hoops. The one that we always come back to is like, when you have an eloquent model that's got 15 different timestamps on it, because you're trying to like track all this different like time data.
Yeah.
Half of it's because you actually need some of those timestamps, and half of it's because you're worried that someday you might need one of those timestamps. Um, and all of these efforts are really just because, in a lot of ways, we're modeling the wrong thing, right? We're trying to represent the passage of time, and like this rich experience that people have in these like static snapshots of a given moment, right? And we just lose so much. And that switch that flipped for me with event sourcing was, oh, if I just represent like the thing that matters in my application, like this this person just was promoted to an admin, right? Or like this account was just deactivated, or like the thing that actually happens, the words that we actually use when we're talking about our application. um if I model those things, then the rest of it I can kind of infer however I need for my application, right? The rest of it just kind of like flows out of that. And that's obviously a core piece of event sourcing, or that in my mind, that is really what event sourcing is. And the rest of it is just sort of like technical ways to approach that sort of that understanding of the world.
Yeah,
But
mitigations on mitigations. Like, oh, now we have this problem we have to solve. So you create a new mitigation for that problem. It's always this way with technology, right? Like you
yes,
have this core kernel, this way of thinking about things, whether it's tying your objects to relational database or whatever else, and then everything else like ripples out of that. It feels like.
yeah, for sure. Does that feel like a fair sort of like base definition to be working from?
Yeah, I think that people often, including myself very much so, couple all these things together because I'm working with all these things together, and what I'm trying to do is find coherent ways of working such that I have all these tools that complement one another. And so I'm often talking about queuing patterns for inter-process communication or inter-service communication, stuff like this, and that has nothing really to do with event sourcing. Event sourcing, event streaming, there's all these other things, but I think trying to when I have the opportunity to sit down with somebody and talk about event sourcing and they're like a programmer and I can work through it, because it's really easy to talk about this also with non-programmers, which is kind of funny. Um,
Mhm.
but I can sit them down and say, okay, now create a class that would be like a normal model for you and put methods on it that you would interact with it. But when you're on the inside, just store a little like associative array representing the thing that happened in that thing. So if I have an order class and you have an order place method, just store inside of it an associative array that says, "Oh, event type placed," with the values, and just do that a few times, and then we run into the need to have understanding of what the previous event states were in order to make decisions about the new state, and we just like step through the process, complicating it only so much as to take it to the next step. And then people like intuitively understand it at its core in like 45 minutes. And it's the kind of thing that if you don't worry about the infrastructure, that's like just a implementation detail, that people saying, don't worry about that. Just focus on the fact that the state changes are just the recording of these whatever data you have available that represents an order being placed or a payment being made. Whatever the data you have is fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's really that's basically what it comes down to, right? It's just and the thing that I always tend to say to people is like, storage is cheap. Like, try to capture as much as you possibly can in your events, right? Try to make your events as closely represent what actually happened as possible. My like go-to joke is like, if I could record like the room temperature at the time that the event fired, I would, like um but yeah, if you accurately describe what happened, then the sort of ramifications of that you can kind of decide after the fact, kind of,
Yeah.
okay, you know, what do we care about? you know?
Yeah.
And as long as you
Like,
have it.
absolutely, and it's like the only state pattern in which you don't lose data. Like there's not a single bit of data lost in this pattern, right? And that's also very special. The way I like to think about it is like the different parts of my application are different people. So a person observes a thing that happened, right? That they remember it, and then they may communicate it to somebody else. So like an order system versus an inventory system or something like that. And there's just two people, and then the inventory system here's what the order person says, and they're like, okay, yeah, I get what these order people are like, but I'm going to remember the fact that they communicated in my own way from my own perspective. And so to me, these systems are just recording the things that happened according to a specific perspective, and then you can have any amount of perspectives that have different incentives or different concerns reflect
Mhm.
on that event in a unique way.
Yeah, I like that. I like that framing of it. That's fun. Um, so then the next piece that always comes up, and this is, I feel like this is your this is the place that our conversation sort of started was when you get into this idea of like the aggregate, right? Which in verbs we call state. I love the term decision model. That's like such a great framing of it, because that's you know I, that's that's how I try to communicate this concept to people, is like,
Yeah.
this data is meant to ask questions of when you need to decide about future events, right? And that's all that it's there for. And so when you say decision model, that's just such a genius term. Um, but you know, very quickly when you're building out these event source systems, you run into this question of like, um, okay, well, can this event be fired based on the current state of the world? Like, the current state of the world does actually matter, right? Like, it's nice, sort of theoretically, to say, well, everything is just like a series of events,
That
but
would
the
be easier.
reality, huh?
That would be easier, yeah.
Yes. But the reality is sometimes you need to understand where we happen to be in that series and what the consequences of some of those past events were, in order to determine whether subsequent events are allowed, or what kinds of subsequent events should be fired, or whatever it is. And so that's when we come to what's often referred to as the aggregate root, or any of these other terms that I said. um and it's funny because I feel like that was the hardest idea for me to wrap my head around. Uh, and now that I do, it feels like such a straightforward concept that I can't even remember why it was so hard for me in the first part. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it's true, that an aggregate as a concept is difficult, like, in any case, like, so I got really into the domain driven design kind of world, and that's how I kind of got deep into the event sourcing, got access to people who knew a lot about it, and they were doing it way before I ever came around, right? And so I had some mentors who could help me navigate this. And so, getting into the all the terminology of the domain driven design stuff had already given me an advantage when coming into this space. But
Sure.
ultimately, the thing that I had to come to realize is that, the model is just events. The thing that matters is just events, and everything else is there to facilitate some idea, like this aggregate or this decision model, as Frank de Jonge, the author of Event Sauce, pitched to me on stream like the other week. It's just a way of loading the events that might be relevant in memory so that we could reflect on them in memory, and that's just it. And then we can reflect on the things that have happened in memory and make a decision about, should I emit a new event saying a new thing happened, or should I prevent that event from ever being emitted? So if that event comes out and is stored, well, it's real now. That's how you know the thing happened, because the events are everything in an event source system.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny. I don't know. I think this maybe exposes my. I'm a self-taught programmer. I
Me
don't
too.
think of myself as a math person, and I don't think of myself as like I don't get real deep into the more like technical theoretical stuff in programming. Um, I had a programming one of the few programming classes I took in college. My professor was like a early AI um, pioneer, and he loved Lisp, and just like
Of course.
the it just everything that was beautiful to him in programming was incredibly frustrating to me in programming.
Hmm.
um but honestly, it took me so long to even understand, like, oh, just like uh just like in MySQL, you have like the aggregate function sum. That's all we're talking about. It's like
Right.
when you
It's a
say aggregate,
reduction.
that's all it is. It's a reducer. Yeah, it's
Yep.
like it's as simple as that. It's just an aggregation of all the events, or yeah, like a reduction of all the events to a single point in time. Um but I am embarrassed to say it took me a long time to like kind of have that aha moment.
Yeah, if I could go back and tell myself, okay, it's really just about you need the events that happened in the past and you need them in memory. And this is the way that we get those events in memory. And then we can write the code that says, oh, if one of the previous events had this value, then it's okay to make a new event. It's really just that easy, but we're so used to doing everything in these data models and like an active record model with its relationships. We do so much with these that with an event source model, some of that logic and behavior is extracted across the system a little bit more evenly, and so you end up with like a chunk of code that is a little bit more distributed than all like located within this one set of data models. It's weird to get used to, for sure.
Sure. Yeah. So like I think the next sort of concept that really landed for me when I was digging into this stuff was um like this idea of like the separation of like a write and a read model. I don't necessarily love those terms. Um but starting to think about like the reality that is right now as a when I'm just dealing with a active record like eloquent. I essentially have to encapsulate all my application's needs into one thing, right? I
Yeah, and
need
if you
to
don't, you pay the price because like
yes.
you could separate like the into different features, but there's so much redundancy. Like the feeling of all the redundancy that you would have to do makes
Yes.
you push it all back into one model. And then you have like this one unified model for all of your different read use cases, for all the ways you want to write to it.
Yeah. Well, and even just like if you learned anything about database normalization or like sort of these the like quote unquote right way to data model, you're kind of like pushed in that direction. Um and yeah, the reality is kind of going back to the original concept. We end up jumping through all these horrible hoops, or having to write either these gnarly join statements or like, run sort of less efficient queries because we just need to jump across multiple tables and gather our data in these strange ways because our UI needs to show the data to the end user in a certain way. But we also need to be able to write to that table in a way that like makes sense from the user's like right perspective, right? They're going and changing some data in a form and hitting save, and they want that data to be saved. But they also want to be able to go to a table and view all the relevant data
Yeah,
connected in the right ways, clickable into the right places, with the right little badges. Like they the end user needs both of those things. And we end up having to do a bunch of machinations to make our data support both of those things when we're talking about like an eloquent model, right?
absolutely. Yeah,
And
I
so
think
go ahead.
that if when you're doing this kind of thing, right, you also kind of lock down your code base over time. So because you have so many different reasons to be interacting with this model. This model might be the most interesting model for this use case, but this model is just a relationship to another use case, right? And they're all interconnected. So what happens in my experience is they're all so highly coupled that it's hard to change one without impacting the others, even if reasonably you shouldn't have to modify the other
Mhm.
feature in order to modify this one. They're all tied together, so it becomes very, very difficult to make a change.
Yeah. Yeah, so then in the event sourcing approach, the upside of all of this is you get to separate those two things. You get to essentially um, write events that describe exactly what happened, and then you get to listen for those events and write to a database the data that your application needs to show the data to the end user or to present the UI. I think like it took me a long time to wrap my head around this idea of really the eloquent models that are like these quote projections that are the end result of these events being fired from my application's UI perspective really are only there to serve the UI. right? They're not
Yeah.
there for any other purpose. But that frees you up to say, oh, well, now I can just build these data models that are 100% optimized for presenting on the screen,
Mhm.
and I can just throw away all these horrible joins and horrible, uncomfortable relationships that I needed, and just write models that make sense for my application's interface, knowing that the other side of it is I get to fire events that are 100% catered to what interaction is happening in the application, right? You get these like two beautiful separate things that when you first read about the concept, right? If you hear about like CQRS or something like that, and you're like, command query, what is going on? But the reality is it's just that there are two different sides to most applications, right? There's the like view side and there's the interaction side, and they have different needs, right? And like you can separate them now.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting consequences of having a read model that's isolated and specific to a specific use case is that you can hand it off to another team and they can own that. And now, because events are fundamentally a decoupling pattern, right? This is just messages themselves are a decoupling pattern. Event is one of the types of messages. Um, you can distribute these different things in various ways, whether they're physically, whether they're based on ownership. Like really, CQRS and is I like the idea of taking this to an extreme where all of the different features, et cetera, all the different use cases are isolated from one another and they can be evolved independently because in my experience, the big trouble that we get into comes from coupling feature after feature after feature until it becomes the amount of time it takes to implement a new feature or to modify a feature just goes up. And what do teams do when that becomes a problem? They do some kind of rewrite, but they use the same fundamental approach that they used in the first place. So it's just a matter of time until that coupling reaches the critical mass where the cost is so high, or so many bugs are introduced from a simple change that what should have been a simple change. But like a read use case is sufficiently different from a write use case, which is different from a different read use case, which is different from a
Mm-hmm.
different read. And so, like having all these isolated from one another, to me, is the true reason that I like to pursue this. I want like a radical separation for maximal of evolution of independent features, right?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting way to think about it. I think that I end up, I think, having a different perspective on certain topics because I've only ever, not just with you, but just in general, I find that this is a place um, where my experience is just different than others. In that, um, I've only ever worked on a team of up to 3 people, and I've worked on the same code base since 1997. um,
Impressive.
so I have I have like a different experience around some of these some of these gotchas, because I've never really had to deal with like, okay, we've got 3 different teams working on 3 different parts of the application, and they're, but they have some overlap and we have to like navigate those barriers. You have to, and I totally appreciate that as the size of your team scales up, solidifying those barriers and really setting some more strict rules about, or those boundaries rather, matters a lot, right? And I just can't really speak to it because it's never been something that I had to deal with. I I really appreciate the fact that I've always been able to work on a small, nimble team that just like we pretty much all have the mental model of the entire code
Yeah.
base. Not to say that I have the full mental model of the code base in my head at all times. You can imagine that over 25 years, you build a lot of features. Um, and there are certainly things that I come back to and I'm just like, how did this work again? I haven't touched this in 5 years. Um, but it's different. And so I don't really, I've just never had to think about event sourcing in that context. I can appreciate how it could be really valuable there. Um, but it's never been a concern of mine, you know?
Yeah, I can appreciate that, and but I would say like I don't want to be I don't want to be interpreted incorrectly. It I push for like radical independence of features. I push for all these things, but for me, my personal values system is in maximally naive systems, right? I want to write the simplest possible thing that will work reliably for my circumstance, tied directly to my circumstance, not a generalized solution that's going to be put into a library and shipped off to solve an infinite number of varying problems. I want to directly tie my code base to the problem I'm facing now. And then as those problems evolve, because we have our new ideas about how we want to solve new things or take on new challenges or react differently, I want the code base to be the exact simplest possible thing that fits that. And so I think that like just because you're like pursuing architecture designs or just because you're pursuing different kind of values, I don't think there's a necessary critical mass of complexity that you have to get to. For example, if I was just building a simple application for myself, maybe I would actually find that like event sourcing my model in this use case is simpler to me than creating an active record implementation, because I don't think that the one is just fundamentally more complex than others. They have trade-offs, but I do think that there is so much complexity in other approaches as well, like the relational model, the data model oriented approach is extremely complicated, over time or in certain circumstances as well. So I just want to like clarify. To me, the simplest possible implementation for whatever it is you're dealing with, that's what I want to go to, because the shortest amount of time I have to spend uh, not solving the problem, or I mean, the time I spend not solving the problem is something I want to completely avoid.
Sure. Yeah, no. I get that. I hope I didn't I don't think that that's not what you're saying. That's double negative there, but um yeah, I mean, I think that that's something I can't say that I always can live up to that. I definitely have a personality that really likes to go towards like framework level thinking. I like, and I end up doing that, and I release a lot of packages for various various problems that we've solved because I like to um, go to that outer level of abstraction. Um, but I appreciate, I know I know that I could probably get a lot more done if I didn't. um, and in a lot of ways, it's just like that's something that I find fulfilling, so I let myself do it. But I do think that you're absolutely right. I mean, the number of times that I've let myself introduce abstractions too early or try to solve a bigger problem than the problem that I have right now and it's come back to bite me is, you know, close to 100% of the times that I've done that. So I'm well aware of that pitfall, and I think that the more you can the more that you can be really um brutally honest with yourself about what the needs of your application right now are and focus in on that specifically, the better a time you're going to have for sure.
Yeah, but how are you gonna find what's simplest, right? If you're not experimenting, there's the other side of the coin. You
Sure.
gotta you gotta play. I think.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I think I almost feel like this wouldn't be an episode of Over Engineered without me talking about the idea of programming as art. I feel like that's just like a theme that I always come back to. And I feel very strongly about that. Like programming is art, and art requires creativity and exploration and I feel incredibly grateful to be able to do a thing that I find fulfilling and I find interesting, and I don't want to give that up in the name of productivity, right? So there absolutely is a balance there, and I don't necessarily feel bad about any of those times when I, over engineered something. Um, because I do think that there was always a lesson to learn, and or it was just fulfilling in the time to do it that way. And okay, I learned from that mistake, right? So it certainly is a balance for sure.
Yeah, I personally, my the most enjoyment I get out of software engineering or programming is when I'm experimenting with something. So, experimenting with something wholly new, it's a sometimes painful process of having to struggle to understand something, having to grind at it until you figure it out, and then you get a good enough idea about what you're doing, and you go and implement it at scale. Now you have a whole ton of different problems and ramifications to deal with, and that's all really cool and fun. But you know I have strong suspicions that software development is going to continue changing, and I'm not talking about like language models or something. We can change our approaches now. Like if I could go back in time 20 years with the things I know now, I could I know that I could like make books, that would change the way that everybody saw everything,
Sure,
because we as an industry have learned so much stuff, and we've made the problems so much easier than, well, I mean, not universally easier, right? There's still a lot of building complicated solutions to fix problems that maybe we didn't need to have in the first place.
sure. But it's still, I mean, for all the complaints about like modern JavaScript tooling, or, the ways that we've made our lives more complicated, uh, people like to look back and think about, oh, it was just like a beautiful time when I could just write a PHP script and open up Cyberduck and drag and drop the file onto the server, and that was the whole story. I don't know, man. I remember those times, and honestly, we have legacy systems where I'm not that far away from those times. We have a legacy system where it's only the last 9-10 months that we had like a pull request process that could happen. Like up until then it actually was FTPing into the server and uploading files direct. It was not great. What we have now is great. We
Yeah,
have a
no,
lot of really lovely things.
I
It's
agree.
a better world now. um so I agree wholeheartedly.
At the very least, we have much more communication, much more education, more mentors, at the very least. Because when I was trying to figure out how to program, I was so thirsty for absolutely anything. And
Yes.
it was like, it was dry.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, yes. Um, so I would love to pick your brain about verbs some, if you're interested in going down into the specifics a little bit. How's that sound to you?
Yeah, I'm interested. I'm not uh nearly like familiar as you are, of course, but I'm not super familiar with the details. So you might have to hold my hand a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm happy to. And I don't expect you to. Yeah. Um, I mean, so I'll give the just like the 30-second, which will probably end up being like 4-minute overview. Um, the main uh the main thing that going into verbs, I know I wanted to solve, and I think I can speak for Daniel that this is true of him too, is when when writing a, I would say, medium-sized application, uh in what in my mind is like a traditional event sourcing sort of paradigm, you just get into this horrible place of, okay, you know I want to introduce a new interaction in my application, right? We'll go back to the user promoted to admin event, right? So in this application that I was working in, or in that case, like a question skipped is an actual event, like it's an exam system, right? So when a question is skipped, uh we want to introduce a feature that allows someone to skip a question and come back to it later in the exam. Okay, so I go and I create my question skipped event, right, that holds the data of the event. Then I go into my aggregate root, or I go into somewhere to write the code that's responsible for firing this event, right? And that code has to do maybe some guarding against, it has to basically query the decision model and ask, is this event allowed to fire? It has to ask, is this person authorized to fire this event? It does all the guards against the state, and then fires the event. And then elsewhere in my aggregate root, I have to add an additional function that listens for the event and updates the aggregate with any additional data that it needs to track for future events. Right. So, okay, we're up to 3 places. Then I have to go into a projector somewhere and add any projection logic around, okay, what's the database state that needs to be updated for my exam system UI to actually reflect the fact that the question was skipped. And then maybe not in the question skipped context, but in another context, maybe I have another place that I go into, a reactor that is going to fire off an email when this event first happens, but won't run again if it's ever replayed. Right. So for this one interaction, I've created a new file. I've created 1, 2, 3, 4 new methods on 3 separate objects, um, all to represent a singular thing. And and this is something that I'm curious if you agree with me on, because in my experience, there's almost always a primary effect of an event. You may have secondary projections that like other parts of your system care about, and it depends on the type of event. Sometimes you may have an event that like a bunch of systems care about deeply, and there really are a number of major effects that are the result of that. But the example of question skipped, it's right. Really, the only thing that this event is there for is to represent the fact that they skipped this question. There's not a whole lot of other parts of my system that care about that one event. Um, and so I just found myself really frustrated by the amount of boilerplate that I ended up writing for every single individual interaction that happened within my application. Um, but before I go on, does that premise uh, resonate with you at all? Like that idea that there's often really one main outcome uh, from many of the events in an evented application?
I think that I might be able to get behind it. The way I think about events is so much the idea that they are reflected on by any amount of observer. And so, in my heart of hearts, all I can think is I don't want to elevate one type of thing above another because to me they're all equally decoupled, right? But if you're talking about like let's just talk about event sourcing a model, not worrying about like some kind of contract that communicates between other systems,
Sure.
right? But if we're just talking about like the internal events of this model, yeah, I think that it's not uncommon that you use the event for changing the state of a state machine. Like there's a conceptual state machine and you want to go from one state to another, and that usually has like maybe one major reaction, right? And so I think this is what you're talking about, and I can get behind that, but there's like a part in me that's screaming that events are to be heard by everyone or by whatever scope you're defining them in, and all of the listeners in those scopes are equal, but I think I can get behind it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you're fundamentally right, and I think that like any system that doesn't allow for that reality, I don't think would be a nice one to use. um, but I think that like in practice, that's been my experience at least, is that more often than not, um, I have this sort of like primary outcome. And then maybe I have some sort of like analytics use case that's also paying attention to that event and is projecting data into some sort of analytical database or something like that. And I might have a bunch of other sort of observers that do care about the event, but they're kind of like secondary to the maybe even secondary to like the user intention, right? The user's intention is that that question is skipped, and maybe my application cares about the question skipped event in a bunch of different ways. I don't know if that's exactly it, but anyway. So that was the like the starting point was just I really love I really love this mental model, but I it kills me every time I have to introduce a new event into my system because I end up writing so much boilerplate um over and over and over again. It's like,
Is it
okay,
boilerplate though? Like, so you implement a new event. Now your system it has the idea of a thing that can possibly happen. Then you implement the dispatching of the event. Now the system has the observation of that thing possibly happening. Then you update a projector, and that projector interprets that event into its own context. And now there is another actor within your system that it is viewing and perceiving this event. So to me, it's like this is cool because all of these tasks can be done completely separately, like from one, like you can do one and deploy it, you can do one, deploy it. They're all really, really isolated. It's really easy to plan. It's really deterministically plannable, right? Like you have a good idea of how much work is involved with it. And it's very also prescriptive. You have a recipe you can follow. It doesn't feel like boilerplate to me, but I might be misunderstanding you.
well, I mean, I think conceptually I agree with you. But in practice, I know my experience was I hate this. Every time I do it, I hate it. You know? Like
Yeah.
I think in theory, you're 100% right. And there are moments when there are plenty of moments when I did fully appreciate one or all of those facets of the experience. You know, there are I think some of the most powerful um, moments in my sort of like journey along event sourcing were times when I realized, oh, I can just start firing events and not worry about the outcome at all right now, right? Like, and or just yeah, in terms of planning the rollout of a feature, being able to separate those different components of the process into different parts of the release. I 100% agree with you there. Um, but I still know that my experience was, especially when I'm just like deep in a feature and trying to like, when all I care about is that the person clicks skip question, and when the page refreshes, they're on the next question in the exam. Um, I hated it every time. I hated every time I had to open those 4 files and add multiple methods to some of them, and it just drove me nuts, um and I think that to some degree that's like it's very much a Laravel sort of um what's the word I'm looking for? There's a very low tolerance, I think, in the Laravel community for anything that doesn't feel good, right?
Many files. Hey, I have like 6 files here. Can I make it one file?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate that that's to some degree that's just like part of the vibes of this ecosystem that I'm in, and
Well,
like
it's like it's good to have like forces pushing against each other. Like design is navigating these like forces that are competing with each other for your specific circumstance, right?
yes. Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um and so when we set out to build verbs, you know, there wasn't there wasn't like one specific like technical need that we were trying to address. And there weren't even like I can't even remember like specifically, oh, I want it to work this specific way. I've always wanted it to work this specific way, and it doesn't work this way, and that bothers me. It was more just like I want the ergonomics of like the primary use case for me to be better, right? I want the like developer experience to feel
Yeah.
better to me. I want this to feel more true to like the Laravel ecosystem and the vibes of like the Laravel community, the like the taste of the average Laravel developer. Um, and what we ended up coming down to was like, why can't you just encapsulate like every piece of this sort of like primary use case into one file? Um, because I think a value that has been emerging in the Laravel community, and I think in general a value that's been emerging in a lot of the like modern programming communities that I'm part of is co-location when that's a good thing, right? I think there was like a really hard push away from co-location at a point in time in sort of under the banner of separation of concerns that I think that there was just like there was like a blending of ideas that ended up pushing people to, oh, we have to put everything in its own place, even if 100% of the time that I change one of these things, I need to change another one. Like they need to be in their own places because
Yeah.
that's the right way to do it. Um, and so I think all of that conspired to kind of just get us to this place of like, what if I just have a like question skipped event that has a handle method on it that writes to the database, and if I need to validate whether that event can happen given the current state of the world, I put a validate method on it.
Yeah.
And if to authorize if that can happen based on the current like logged in user, I put an authorize method on it. Um, and if I get to the point where this event like has many observers and there isn't sort of like a single like official handler, I can move that stuff out into dedicated projectors. I can go with like the more traditional approach if I need to, but like especially for early rapid prototyping and for events where it really is just like there's just mostly just one use case. Now to make a change, I just change one file. And if I need to like remove this event, right, for some reason, like, or not necessarily remove the event, but if I need to change something, I just have one place to go to change.
Sure.
I have all the context for the most part in one place. Um, that that became sort of the driving force or sort of like the star that we were aimed at for verbs.
Yeah, I mean, I think I get where you're coming from. I would say that there's a lot of what you're talking about that is like dirty, like dirty
Mhm.
software design in a way that to me I'm considered dirty in that way. Like I like to question why are these things structured so ornately? Like, did we need like a baroque structure in our application? Like, I had this idea forever ago. What if I just make my command? Like, I like the command bus, right? I like being able to say, this is a unit of behavior that I want to run, and then I have a command pipeline where I'm doing logging and metrics and tracing and stuff like this on this, so whenever I have a new service behavior, I can implement a command and I immediately benefit from my pipeline. So this is
Mhm.
something that works for me. I've heard a lot of people have a negative view of that. That's fine. But I had this idea of I'll construct my command with the constructor, and it'll store the properties in this object, but I'll have a handle method on the object which will execute the command. And what I can do is I can drop the command through the pipeline. All the same things happen, but the very last piece of the pipeline just calls that handle method with and reflects on that method for dependencies and injects the dependencies into that handle method. And everybody's like, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. But I promise that in my application, it was like the properties of the command and the execution of the command all in one place. It seemed like it couldn't be more simple. So this is not something that I think works in every environment, but I love when people are willing to commit to something that's kind of dirty in this way.
Yeah. No, I that's 100% right. Yeah. I recognize that to a certain eye, this is like everything bad, you know? Um and I don't really care. It's like it works. It works well. It feels architecturally sound, when you actually use it. Um, it it makes code review feel glorious. um, it makes discoverability really solid, right? It's like, um, this is a thing. This is another thing that I'm a particular believer in is, you know, uh, Laravel applications follow a very specific, like, sort of conventional pattern in terms of like the structure, the file structure of the application, right? Um, and for us, our application is pretty large. It's like, it's trending into the millions line of code region. Um, and being able to break things out into individual modules that like share, common domain, not necessarily, uh not necessarily being incredibly strict about that, but just like knowing that if I need to figure out something that's going on in our billing system, I open up the billing module, right? If I need to figure out something that's going on in exams, I open up the exams module. I I lost your audio.
I'm sorry. It's just about what's cohesive, right? These things go together. Other things don't go together. Why not stick them together where you can find it?
Exactly. Yeah. And I find that this approach with verbs feels very much the same. It's like when I need to understand the process that happens when a user skips a question, I just open that one event and I can read it top to bottom. Our coding standard is that like the methods on the event are ordered in the same order that they fire in like the life cycle of verbs.
Mhm.
So, you just read down authorize, validate, apply, handle. You have all of that context. Um, and it feels like a really, really nice approach to this problem. Um, and like I said, if you end up having, for example, like an analytics system that cares about a bunch of different events and needs to project them into some other place, you just register an analytics projector into the system, and it just tells verbs which events it cares about, and it can also listen to those events and do something else when they fire. Um, but that's like a separate process.
Sure. So
Um,
I imagine you could structure your application so wherever is the authority for raising that event, you will co-locate kind of the consequences of that event being dispatched in that area, and then if you have like another system that is like not directly related to that context, you might choose to have a more separate like listener or something that reacts to that. That
100%.
way you're not mixing all of these pieces, all the different contexts together.
Yeah. Yeah, it lets you have those boundaries when you need them, right? And kind of have that more abstract, like, um everyone listens to all the events that they should be able to listen to and can independently do what they like with them. But it also has the advantage of like in the places where there's like one very tightly coupled system that cares about this event, like uh you're not spreading that around, even though it is still coupled, but now it's like across a bunch of different pieces of that system.
Yeah, so I'm really fond of kind of good jumping immediately into the deep end of this whole thing and like spreading things out and working with it that way. That might have to do with the fact that I've been working with event sourcing and production for like almost 10 years now or something like this. I don't know. When I see frameworks, like whether they do things the way that I like to do them or not, but when I see that, okay, they acknowledge that here are some concerns. Concern one, like maybe we're talking about locality, right? Concern two, maybe so locality can be reflected on here as there are changes that you're directly tying to your event. And you want to put it all together, or you want something that's less local and you have a listener in another context listening to it. But as to acknowledge that these circumstances exist and to give a route for the developer to be able to make the selection for themselves. That to me is, as long as those things are provided, that those are great features. And what's the worst that can happen, right? uh I think it's really cool to create more models for this kind of stuff. I think that you don't need to worry about like the old guard who had their specific ways that they use all the time. Uh, that's not really interesting. What's interesting is getting a whole lot of people involved, trying a bunch of stuff. Maybe some of it doesn't work, maybe some of it does, and then learning from that, right?
Yeah. Um, I have two different paths that we can go down, and I want you to pick. Um, the one thing that I have been curious to get your take specifically on, is I am tempted to, or I'm feeling like the sort of um, the next stage for verbs is perhaps leaning further into um, this reality that this is a system for the typical Laravel app, right? That it works. It's built to work generally with a traditional relational database, um, and it typically happens synchronously. Um, and I think that there are some interesting things that we could kind of like consider that in the abstract maybe would make some folks very angry. But uh even things like, what's stopping us from providing some good tooling that lets you um reflect on existing events, maybe, provide some sort of like PHP attributes that provide data about like the migration from like different event versions, for example, and then just like have a command that lets you run through the entire events table and just update past events to reflect the new changes, right? Like that's something that's always been a little bit. I have tended to treat the events table as like this sacred place. Not entirely. We've done a lot of like sort of um, pushing like synthetic historical events into the event store, which has been really powerful for us. But in a lot of ways, I try to sort of have this mental model of like, okay, once an event's been written to the database, like that's the reality, and any changes have to happen in future events, right? But like, I think there's like an interesting question of sort of what other rules could we break, as it were, if we kind of like constrain ourselves right now to um, just like thinking about verbs as a tool for a sort of traditional or a modern Laravel application. Um, that's option one. Or if you just want
Okay.
to go down that path, we can.
well, I have thoughts. So a lot of these principles, like the immutable event store, right? These principles are there to prevent like foot gunning, right? They're there to deal with practical concerns more than philosophical concerns. Like let's say you rewrite some of your event streams at a reasonably low scale, really low risk in general. If you feel like you can reproject or you don't need to reproject, right? If you feel like that there's no issues with this, that's fine. But I think a lot of the the understanding of these approaches is based on significant experience in a wide variety of circumstances, leading people to certain generalized patterns. And it's not that you need to adopt these generalized patterns, right? Because maybe if you say I'm not going to support all patterns or all circumstances, rather I'm not going to support all circumstances if you're processing 100,000 events every like 30 seconds or something like that, maybe that's okay. I don't need to deal with that right now. Then you can make different trade offs, right? And you can optimize for things that others are not optimizing for to get advantages that others don't have. And so, yeah, like when, like, so I work on a transaction processing system, and so I tend to be a little bit more like old school in my value set when it comes to this system, because I know that if I start to get in and like I demand a huge amount of historical data in my event store and I start rewriting it, the cost of reprojecting is going to be significant to me and to my
Sure.
team, and I have to make decisions about how the system's built with these considerations in mind. But in a different context, like my previous company, there's no way I was going to have scale like anything like this. So I could literally just decide myself. I would have a way to cursor over and stream events from the event store. Function, a Lambda function, it takes the event. It says, okay, if it's of event type this, return a new event that's the same exact one, but with slightly different data because I'm making a correction, and then save it. That's something I've done with no consequence because I understood the circumstances I was in. But there are limits to this kind of thing, right? If you're willing to accept this, then I think that it's fine. But I think it would be really cool also if you're going to go down that route to really make it clear these are the limitations of this. You know, if you can really communicate those effectively, then that can help people make a decision. And I definitely think that there is a middle middle tier of an application that's not like a super big application. Maybe I don't know. Like maybe if we divided the size of a scale of an application, or if it's traffic or whatever relevant metric it is, into like 5 pieces. If you're like in 1, 2, or maybe 3, you can get away with certain things that are kind of like murder in the rest of them. I say that's pretty cool too. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I don't know. That's my, that, this is kind of what we were talking about on your stream is like, um, I feel like, we deal with, uh, decent scale, right? Um, we're not PayPal, right? We're not Blue Sky. Um, but we have data from hundreds of thousands of users and at different points in time, we will have lots of people taking exams simultaneously and having to communicate data about those exams to dozens of different state licensing bodies per person. And, like it can scale out to a place where we have to at least think about it a little bit, right? It's not like uh, at that point in the application where you're just like, you can kind of just do
Yeah,
whatever.
Wild
It doesn't
West.
matter, right? Um, but even at that scale, which I think is like, um, I think is like a formidable target for many like applications, right? For a lot of people, if you get to hundreds of thousands of users, you're going to be quite happy, right? Like that's going to be a successful business. Um, Even at that scale, I think we can get away with a lot of these more naive approaches to how we manage our events. And so it feels to me like potentially leaning into that even further. Like you said, we might be able to find some um, serious advantages there, right? Where the disadvantages are unlikely to impact folks until they're at a point in time in their applications like life where they're having to deal with those problems in a bunch of different ways, and like you're going to have to think about re-architecting, finding new approaches to a bunch of different things, and this will just be another one of them. That's what I'm leaning towards right now. And obviously I don't want to go too far down that path, right? I don't want to like lead people down a path that they're going to quickly come to regret. um, but I think there's something interesting there if we kind of like allow ourselves that constraint, you know?
Yeah. So I think if you say, "Hey, look, you want to rewrite some events, you want to correct some events, here's this tool to do it. Warning: this isn't going to reproject all your projections. Warning: this isn't going to whatever. Uh, use at your own discretion." I mean, it's perfectly valid. What's the problem? Like the kind of traditional approach that like people bring up is stuff like, let's just reproject the entire event store into a new event store, and then blah blah blah. Like there, it's not any simpler. Like the if you know, having opinionated approaches with the tooling to support that, that's the tooling is everything. Like I've written a projection manager is able to reproject projections. I've written a projection manager that doesn't, like, I don't write like Laravel migrations, for example, for a projection. I use the migration as a custom part of a projection component, so that that projection component can just spin up a new projection with a different database table if I'm using a relational database, while the other projection's still running. And then I
Yeah.
can just switch them over, right? Like if you can make this, you can make it data driven, you can do all kinds of stuff. But the tooling has to support it. If you're doing it all by hand, it's going to be exhausting and laborious, and there's going to be a high chance of error. But if you can make these tools and you can make them work and make them easy, then more power to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think that like, um, the tooling is obviously a big piece, and that's something that we've been, um, focused on, is like it has to be well supported by the framework, and that we have to give you the, as much, uh, a highest chance of success as possible, right? Um, the other topic that I've been thinking about a ton, and honestly, like there's a tiny part of me that wants to re-architect all of the verbs event store to sort of like lean further into this, is another topic that came up on your stream. I can't remember who it was who brought this up, and I'm even blanking out on the exact term, but like the idea of like dynamic consistency layer, or is that what it was
Yeah, it's
called?
dynamic consistency boundaries. It's a concept that's really pushed by Sarah Pellegrini, and I believe she has a presentation called "Kill the Aggregate." I think is what it's called. So you can just search for "Kill the Aggregate," and
Okay.
you'll find her presentation online.
um that that whole idea just really, really resonated with me. Um, One decision that we made with verbs was that we wanted to let events be associated with multiple states, right? That there wasn't in the event sourcing package that I had been using. There was very much like a one-to-one relationship between an aggregate and an event. Um, and that never that never was a huge constraint for me, I found. But it Daniel definitely bumped into it a lot, and he advocated for it. I wasn't a huge believer until we kind of like got down this path a ways. Um, but now I really do appreciate that, like, for certain types of systems, um, there's like a bunch of different types of decisions that are all fairly isolated from each other, that happen around different events, right? Especially if you're like talking about a game, right? The the game rules kind of have a whole subset of rules that relate to like the player, right? And then you have rules about the board state maybe, and you might have rules about like the player's like the player's hand, right? If it's like a card game. And all of those impact the question of like, are they allowed to like make this move or play this card or do this action? Um but they're all fairly isolated decision context, right? There's like a rule about what size a player's hand can be, right? And that's fairly separate from like the rules about, you know, can this card be played at this particular time on the board, right? Um and so I think the idea of um splitting your decision models up into these small chunks, right? And letting your event be associated with as many different um different states as you need, um, feels really good. And the thing that came up in your stream that really struck me was if you because right now our system is coupled to states and state IDs, right? So like you would have like a board state and a player state and a hand state, maybe, right? In that example. And each one of those has to have like a globally unique ID in the system, and you reference each of those by that ID. Um, but the idea of being able to just like have your states be associated with potentially like just an arbitrary string, like a username, um, like an arbitrary, globally unique thing that like lives in the world. Another good example that came up is like a URL, right? Like if you're potentially building a system that's maybe crawling a site and needs to like hold some data about whether a page has been crawled or whether an error has been whether we've hit some sort of error threshold on like retries on a given URL or something like that. um this idea of opening that up even further to just like, yeah, you may have some IDs that are just like a UUID, but you may have other IDs that are a username or a URL or a timestamp or anything that's sort of just like globally unique. Has kind of like set my brain on fire.
Yeah.
uh, I'm curious your thoughts there. I know we're close to or we've kind of hit the end of the time we allotted, so I also want to I can keep on going, but if you need to jump, like I don't want to take up too much of your time.
Yeah, maybe we could like talk about this topic for a minute because I have a couple thoughts. Specifically, I get the urge to have arbitrary queryable event streams so that you can say, I want to make a decision based on arbitrary boundaries, right? And there's ways to do this already using like the aggregate event stream approach. Um, Now, I'm not passing a judgment on the dynamic consistency boundary concept. I'm definitely not doing that. But it's worth noting that, for example, have you ever coupled I don't know what your experience with aggregates are, but have you coupled two aggregates together? Um, because you can definitely couple aggregates together. And so I've done some game development with event sourcing because game development is one of my hobbies. And of course, the second I drop into, I'm like, how can I do this with event sourcing, and like what are the ramifications of that? And one of them is you can pass like one aggregate into the method of another and have them interact in this way. So you might have the concept of let me think of how to map this. I'm just going to go ahead and say you might make a charge against a transaction intent, and that charge will be to charge somebody money. But for each transaction intent, you don't want to make two charges, right? So how do you model that? Like so that because each charge has its own life cycle, it doesn't know about a previous attempt, right? So
Mhm.
I might have an aggregate that's a transaction intent aggregate, and and I hate the word aggregate so much. Okay, and I might have a charge that's like a charge that is an aggregate. So when I create a new charge, I pass in the transaction intent that I intended to use it, and inside that method, I'm saying, hey, transaction intent. I'm going to begin a new charge now, and here's my identifier, and that aggregate can say, oh, I already have a charge attempt running. I'm going to completely deny this going forward, right? So it throws an exception or however you want to do it, and it prevents this from happening. And so this is one way in which you can have multiple things tied together. And then what the outcome of that is the transaction intent has its own history. Like, oh, here the intent was registered, a charge began, and then it has its own perspective on the other charge. It knows when the charge began, and it has its completely separate event stored in its own event stream about that event. But in the charge itself, it was like, oh, charge requested or something like that. It's a different perspective on the same occurrence. So that's like one way that we can get this kind of outcome, which is literally just to bring these models together, not dissimilarly to how you would do any two objects.
Sure. Yeah,
And I've
and like I
yeah,
said,
go ahead.
that's
Sorry.
been kind of my experience in our existing application. the places where that has come up, there have been solutions that have worked, and it hasn't been a huge problem for me. So at first, I didn't see this as like a particularly important like pursuit. Um, so yeah, I definitely appreciate that there are other ways to approach this problem.
You also have this idea of like there's a dynamic consistency boundary, and it's like for example, I think you use username as an example. So let's say anything that's happening to a user, those can be happening in any stream, right? But they're tagged to a user, so you can query it as a new stream with the stream ID, that username, or for example, right? This is like the kind of the fundamental nature of the dynamic consistency boundary, which is anything that's queryable in the event store that returns multiple events becomes a stream in itself. And one of the ways that people have done this before is that as part of an automatic system, they project references to events into its own stream. So like you can just arbitrarily create streams and reference those events as, like, you could think of them as links or pointers. So they fill the spot an event would fill, but your system already knows that, oh, this is a reference. I'm going to go grab those references that construct the stream and send it to the application. And it can do that without duplicating the data, with just having a little bit of extra data for that pointer. That's another way that this has been solved. So this to me
Mhm.
is very similar to the dynamic consistency boundary concept, but it's a little bit more structural. So you have a structure in your event store that points to all the different events with that event stream. Whereas the dynamic consistency boundary, it feels like you're constructing a query that will have the outcome of querying in this stuff. So you'll have
Mhm.
to decide that one of the challenges that you have to face with this, though, is that when you have aggregates and event streams, it's very easy to identify on what scope you want a some kind of lock to exist, right? So if you're using and Bastian, a gentleman I'd never met before, but came on the stream to talk about this on my stream. He mentioned, okay, there's a mechanism for doing an optimistic locking here, and then people who are doing pessimistic locking, they have to define a key around which they're locking. So a normal way of locking might be saying, oh, I'm attempting to process this transaction. Maybe I'll lock on the transaction identifier. But with the dynamic consistency boundary, locking on a key becomes a problem, because you know, how do you lock a resource um, such that you know that this resource is being locked whenever wherever it's interacted with? So I think that Sarah and maybe her collaborators, I don't know exactly who's working on this, but I know Sarah was a major advocate of it. They might have come up with a good optimistic locking strategy that may work. But I personally have not become fluent enough in it to really be convinced that this is the strategy that I would move forward with. But I think that if you explore this, and if you identify that this is like really meaningfully, like it gives you liberation to explore new ways of handling this, then I think that's great. The last thing in the world I want is for people to stand on dogma and and not make progress here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. So how like the question specifically of like, how do you ensure the uniqueness of a username in an event source system? Um, comes up a lot in like the Verbs Discord. That's like a
Yeah, of
question that people
course.
come up to, right? And my answer up until now is like, you just need some sort of reservation system, or some. You need to solve this in some other way,
Yeah,
right?
it's a valid approach, right?
Um, because it's not like you're going to have uh, an aggregate that just holds every single username that's ever been registered in your system. Like that's not a realistic way to approach this. Probably.
Well, like, what is an aggregate, right? Like, it's an in-memory projection. You don't have to have an in-memory projection. You can write it to a database. Is it so bad to have a database table that is just every single username you have, for example? So, if your system allows for configurable, immediately consistent versus eventually consistent projections, then you can have in certain interactions like immediately consistent projections for these things, right?
Yeah, I think that gets at, I think for a lot of people, um it's easy to get into this mindset of, okay, all my projected data should be disposable, right? And I do think that that's like a useful mental model of like sort of enforcing this like read write boundary, is if you kind of like have this general mindset of like, okay, all of my, the only thing that matters is the events, right? Everything else I could theoretically throw away and reproject. Um, and so when you have that like mindset, then the idea of relying on a usernames table, um, I mean, even there, you can kind of just
It's the
reproject it
same. It's the same as an
and
aggregate. It's just
yeah,
not in memory because it's
right.
not practical to be in memory. If it was practical to be in memory, it would just be in memory, and who cares? But like the difference is, like with projections, we usually think of them as purely eventually consistent. So you're not you either that this is why the uniqueness problem is a problem, because if two users sign up at the same time with the same username, the check occurs, and but the first user who was there first just simply hasn't had theirs written yet. That's a race condition. That's a fundamental problem. So now what do? There's usually like a line blocking mechanism that's necessary. Let's block at let's create a lock for this resource, and if you try to access it, you just wait your turn, and then you get to go, right? But nobody wants to have the entire system locked up because everyone is creating new accounts and it's dealing with this thing. So why not just have a projection and write it to a database table or any other, like Redis, who cares? Like whatever can handle the problem, and just say, hey, I'm going to do this either inside the same transaction if it's in the data store, or yeah, yeah, just put it in the same data store. Like this is a limitation that you're applying to yourself in this kind of problem, but it solves the problem also. I mean, it opens you up to a few things. It opens you up to slightly higher risk, because if there's a problem with this write or something, then the process can fail or whatever. But um, traditionally, I would just say, hey, just have an interface, have a something behind it, and have a service that's dedicated to unique emails. And I don't care how you write it, right? It's just an interface at this point. So whenever you say member registration aggregate, you pass in the properties of that member. You're also passing an instance of that interface that is able to handle that uniqueness. And then inside your aggregate, it integrates with that domain service to make the decision of if this is a valid user. That's how I would generally say it. But what's behind this interface or what's happening back there, it doesn't matter as long as you can rely on it being immediately consistent.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and the goal or my plan had always been to essentially uh either provide a built into Verbs, or a first party package that adds support for some sort of, database based uniqueness, maybe not even purely uniqueness, but like I feel like in general, being able to reserve unique values and being able to keep an ongoing count essentially, are just two things that come up over and
Yeah.
over. And I thought,
Global constraints, basically.
yeah, exactly. And if we just provided a built-in service that supported that, I think that that would help a lot of people out. But I just got kind of excited about this idea of, oh, but if you just treat the username as its own state, you know, then you can just track, okay, has this username been registered? Has
Yeah.
this username been banned? Has this username been migrated to a new username? Transition to an email address based like
But what's
login,
the downside? Why wouldn't you do this? Like, what's the downside?
Um, well, I mean, I think the big downside is it introduces some complexity in the event store, right? Like you end up having to um you have to think about how you're modeling the system that stores and retrieves events differently. You have to think about like key indexes. Like I think that there's a bunch that comes down to like Verbs would have to solve this problem
Mhm.
well. Um, but I think that if Verbs solve the problem well, the main downside to the end user maybe would be around the locking question. But I even think that the framework could provide
I would love for your
solution to
framework to
that.
like just say, "Hey, look, this is what you're going to do. If you want consistency, you're using the same data store, and we're doing optimistic locking, and we're doing it for you, and that's just how it is." But the one problem I see, for example, is like when you start, this may not be even something you're interested in, but if you start partitioning your event store, right now you have to have those kind of uniqueness things. You might have to partition those as well based on how you partition your store,
Yeah,
and the
sure.
complexity that comes out of that. This is why I create these general patterns that continue to work across a wide variety of circumstances. This is why, like, I don't generally rewrite my event store. This is why I don't generally why I want to model so my event streams are as simple as possible. This is why I don't use my event streams to populate the aggregate and then put a bunch of getter methods on the aggregate so other parts of the application can just read out of the aggregate. I don't do these things because then this, like in my experience, I hit some kind of circumstance where I want to change things, and these things end up so coupled together that my reads are coupled to my writes now, and all of these things that I have gone through all this trouble to learn all of these design patterns to avoid. And now I did it again. I coupled it all together again. So I think that there is a balance, and you can probably find a way to navigate this terrain that where you're creating value. But I just can't help but to think like it's safe. It's safer if I use these tools because I can see how I can get away with partitioning my data, which I will do like anytime. Like I will partition my event store. Absolutely. The second I get a chance to, the second I have a single reason to, I want to partition that so that I can horizontally scale the event store. I can horizontally scale all of the projections. I want the system to have a flat performance profile so that it doesn't just keep getting slower over time. And I want to be able to implement that into the system. And that's inherent to the kind of problems I'm looking to solve. I think you can do this. I think you can navigate it, but you're going to have to be really critical about what the downsides are of the patterns you're implementing and trying to balance those.
Sure. Yeah, it's I haven't made a decision yet. I think that I think both of the approaches seem perfectly viable, um, and there's a lot of upside to sort of the original concept of just like implementing some sort of reservation system that's like native to verbs. Um, so I don't know. I've just been mulling it over, but I really enjoyed that part of the stream because I just hadn't come across that idea, and it really does solve some real problems that
Sure,
I have
absolutely.
bumped into many a time in like a really elegant way. Um, if you kind of like hand wave around some of the implementation concerns.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a reason why very smart people who have a lot of experience in this area are exploring this, right? I think there's like real value to be had here.
Yeah.
Um, and I personally have some friends who are like just infatuated with the idea, and maybe I have a lot to learn about it before I get too excited about it. I'm struggling to see how it solves my problems because I don't seem to be having those problems. But this is just maybe a limitation of my experience of the things I'm specifically doing. And maybe if I was having different problems to solve, this would be much more exciting for me. Either way, I trust the people who are working on it. Like they seem like really intelligent people, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Awesome. All right. Well, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we start to close up?
Uh, I don't know. I think that I'm good. I wouldn't mind having a couple people maybe show up for my Twitch stream every Sunday if some of your viewers are listening. That would be
Yeah,
cool. It's like,
absolutely.
yeah, it's Twitch TV / Shawn McCool, and that's it. Just every Sunday, I'm trying to do a stream, and it's highly experimental. I don't know where I'm going to go each episode, but you can check out my YouTube channel under the same name, right? And it has old streams, so I don't know, give that a shot. I'd really prefer though to have people come on and chat during the stream. That would be like my preference. Ideally, it's not like me rambling into the void for an hour and a half, right? I'd love to have more people come in and talk to me about their challenges learning about it, or exciting new ideas they have, or just disagreeing with me on my approach, right? That'd be very cool too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was gonna be my next question is there anything that you wanna promote, or and how do people find you? You touched on it, but is there anything else that you've got going on that, uh, I don't know, you're excited about, you want people to check out?
Uh, not really, not really. Like this, the stream and having the conversations is really kind of like the thing I have the energy to do after my work day, and so that's where
Sure.
I'm putting all my effort, I guess.
Okay, so that's consistently on Sundays.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Sunday evening my time, so it's 1600 UTC plus one. So however that breaks down to you. So it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon Amsterdam time.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and that ends up being, mid-morning for us East Coasters,
I'm
and,
trying my best to get to the Americas. I really am.
yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to find a time that works for everybody, but I that covers a pretty good span.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to check it out. It's been really fun to watch. I've only got to watch one live and the tail end of another, but like you have those recorded,
Yeah.
so you can go back and watch them, and yeah, like it's great to hop on there, even if you don't know much about event sourcing. I'm quite certain that Shawn is happy to have you on to just like ask ask those introductory questions, because like a lot of really interesting things can come out of that too. So everyone out there who's like, a little bit interested in event sourcing, a little bit interested in verbs, like watched Daniel's talk at Laracon, is like, damn, that was cool, but I don't know how to get started. Like, check Shawn's Twitch stream out. And also, I mean, I know Event Sourcery is has been around for a while, but um, really anyone who wants to get into event sourcing, it's still an incredible free resource to learn about the principles. And I love how you sort of like build things up from the ground up just with like plain old PHP. Um, it's not you don't have to learn about a specific event sourcing framework or methodology. It's just like, let's just step through these concepts in the simplest way possible, and I think it's a great way to learn. um and then I know that you're still on Twitter, you're also on Blue Sky. Is it you're at ShawnMcCool.com, or what's your handle?
Yeah, it's Shawn SHAWN MC.cool. That's my blue sky. And
Love it.
that's really where I'm preferring to do everything. That's also my website, by the way, ShawnMC.cool. You can get a hold of me there if you want to chat about anything. I'm really super interested in having conversations with people, especially if I can get you on webcam on stream. That would be the best possible situation. But I'll talk to you about anything if you'll fire up your webcam. So let's do that.
Awesome. All right, Shawn, this has been so much fun. Thank you for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.